Okay. Now, my complete name is Oliver James Barr III. And it's just like it sounds, the name Barr is B-A-R-R.
Okay. And the highest rank served in the 10th Mountain Division?
First Lieutenant.
How about if you start by telling me a little bit about how you were at Dartmouth and then how you came to be in the 10th?
Yeah, that was kind of a sucker move, but it's kind of a fun story. I had a very good friend named John Montaigne. You may know of him. Was a professor of geology in Bozeman, Montana, still lives there. And Charlie McClane was considered the first man into the 10th Mountain Division. You may have heard that he reported, and he said he reporting to the 10th Mountain Division, and the sergeant said, "Son, you are the 10th Mountain Division." That was Charlie McClane. And he wrote back glowing letters to John Montaigne about skiing on Mount Rainier, living at Paradise Lodge. After a day of skiing in deep powder, they would go back to the lodge and beautiful waitresses would join them drinking beer, singing songs, and all of that. Well, after a few of those letters from McClane, John and I both decided, well, that sounds like a pretty good way to fight a war. So we both signed up.
How many Dartmouth boys were there?
In the 10th, I think about 150. As I mentioned, Ken McDonald may have the complete list. Well, I was at Dartmouth, and a good friend of mine, John Montaigne, was a good friend of Charlie McClane, who was reputedly the first man in the 10th Division. And Charlie wrote back these glowing letters about the, you better hold up, that sun is really...
Oh, do you want me to move you a little bit? I was trying to use the sun as a big light.
What?
I can, how about if I move you at a little more of an angle? Then you can look.
That would help.
Yeah. So I'll move you. You don't even have to do more than just scoot your chair towards me. And where this cup is, it will
See
be
that?
where your
Yeah,
chair is.
that'll be worse because the sun is right there.
But it will be not in your eyes.
I think it will. See, I'll be facing
Like you'll be facing me. Is it
this
better
way.
now? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So now what are you suggesting?
I'm just gonna have you just
Turn?
stand up and I'm gonna move your whole chair. Okay, you're back.
Yeah, that'll, I'm sure, be better.
Yeah. I don't want to get in flat. Take a few breaths.
Yeah. Thank you.
I could use a little bit of that myself.
Take a swig.
All right. Will it take 10 years off my life? Does that explain?
I
your
don't think
good
so.
skin tone?
I don't think so.
I know people like to sniff oxygen because it's supposed to keep them young.
Football players do too.
Yeah, I heard Michael Jackson did it too.
That could be.
Because your body gets more oxygen and.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, I promise I won't belabor this too long. But, one thing I will do is I'll ask you some semi-standard things and then some stuff that I know that I want to make sure I talk to you about Mussolini's villa.
Okay.
Because that's what Tom Haynes and I talked about. And then I always ask if there's more things that, later on you'll wish you had mentioned. So that's kind of how I run this. Most of them can run an hour or 2 hours, but it's whatever you want it to be, really.
If I put on dark glasses, would that ruin it?
Why don't you put them on? Let's see.
That helps a lot.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's absolutely fine. I don't want you to melt. Only bad witches melt. notorious we have.
Yeah, Charlie McClane,
Right.
who was a Dartmouth class of 41, maybe even 40. But anyway, he was the first man in the 10th Mountain Division, theoretically at least. And he wrote this John Montaigne, these glowing letters about skiing on Mount Rainier and how beautiful it was. And then they would go back to Paradise Lodge, where they were put up in nice buildings. And they would have nice dinners served by beautiful waitresses. And then they would drink beer and sing songs and have a wonderful time after that. So, you know, John and I both sounded like that's a pretty good way to fight a war. So we both signed up, and a lot of Dartmouth guys did.
Did you feel like those letters were accurate?
Well, they were accurate at the time, but we knew, of course, that that was temporary. And in fact, by the time I arrived at Fort Lewis in June, the troops had come down from Mount Rainier. So the only skiing I did at Mount Rainier was on weekends. But I went up several times, skied with Bob Parker a lot, who was active in Vail later. And on one of those occasions, I almost got killed because I came across a crevasse, and it wasn't marked in any way, and it just opened up in front of me, and all I could do was jump. Luckily, I could jump far enough to get over the end of the crevasse and land in the snow. But I was scared, Bob was scared, and we never went there again.
Oh my gosh.
It's hard to say what kind of an experience it was, but it certainly was one of the most important experiences of our lives. The whole thing, training and combat.
Why?
Well, it was very unusual. The ordinary person would never do what we were doing, either in training or in combat. So, with all of one of the things about a group of men, probably women, is that the worse the conditions you put them in, the higher their spirits. And so a lot of the time we had wonderful spirits. All of the guys were pals, you know, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere to be in.
Now, when you had the easiest conditions, do you think that kind of contributed to sort of depressed spirits?
Well, in a way. I have a story about that, and that is on one hike, I was leading my platoon up into the mountains, and everybody was grousing and grumbling, and a couple of the guys even refused to go on until I practically kicked them in the tail. And but we kept going, and then it started to rain cats and dogs. Well, you should have seen the change. All of a sudden, that whole platoon, instead of grousing and grumbling, was happy, laughing, singing, having a marvelous time, because all of us were facing a hardship together. And it was a remarkable experience and lesson to me, because if you put people in a difficult situation, they're going to respond as well as they can.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I never heard that before.
Yeah, it's true though. Yeah. These guys, they were all grumbling, as I say. A couple of them wouldn't go on. Unfortunately, they were Dartmouth men. But when it started to rain, I tell you, the whole group. And then we got into camp. It was typical for a group like that. When they came to camp, they would kind of form up, try to look real good, and double time into camp. You know, impress the people with, boy, look at these guys. They've been out on a 10, 15-mile hike. They come double timing into camp. Boy, look at that. So when we got there, they all did that, and we're all pretty tickled.
Now, when you think back about your letters of recommendation, can you recall who gave you letters of recommendation and what they said?
Yeah, I can. A classmate at Dartmouth was a fellow named Bob Billings, who owned the Brattleboro Hotel in Vermont. The Brattleboro Hotel was a hot spot for skiing in Vermont at that time. And so Bob gave me one recommendation, and then his brother Les Billings gave me another. And then there was a fellow named Mezzie Barber, who at that time was the national alpine champion, which is a combination of jump and cross country, just those two. Unusual event. And Mezzie was the alpine champion that year. and he wrote the third one.
Do you know what was in your letters?
Well, yeah, they all lied a little bit, you know, and said what a great skier I was. I would say that I was a high intermediate at best. They made it sound like I was pretty professional, but I was high intermediate.
What was it that really made you want to be in the 10th more than anything else?
Well, first I tried to get into the Air Corps, and I couldn't do it because I wore glasses. And then I thought, well, the Navy would be nice, and the Navy wouldn't take me either. They had some great programs, the Air Corps and the Navy, and you would go to school for a while, and when you came out, you would either be a second lieutenant or an ensign. But I couldn't do that either. But I did love skiing, and so that was what I'd say it was my third choice, but it turned out really well.
What do you think is the value of saving all these memories of men who served in the 10th?
Well, they're memories that the ordinary person in the ordinary course of life would never experience. And so anybody who reads them will be exposed to a whole different set of circumstances than they could ever expect to be in themselves. And I think that would probably be interesting to quite a few people.
Did you have a sense at the time that you were making history? You were saying that your point of view were things that other people didn't normally get to see or hear, but did you have a sense you were making history?
To tell you the truth, I don't think that we gave too much thought to that. I think it was after the war that we realized what a unique division we were in. At the time, most of us really enjoyed the skiing and the outdoor life. I mean, it was something we enjoyed doing, and the training, although it was difficult, was something that we really kind of got a kick out of, even though it was hard. And so I don't think we considered making history, because the hundreds of other military units were doing somewhat similar things. And it was after the war, I think, that we realized that this was a unique division. There never was one like it before, and there never will be one like it again. And to that extent, I think we now consider that we did make history.
How do you think you shaped history?
Well, I suppose it goes back to the Finnish troops, Finland, when they were fighting Russia. A handful of Finnish troops in white ski outfits fought off much superior forces for a long time in Finland. And then when they started our division, we were capable of fighting in areas and fighting fairly easily and fairly well and efficiently that I don't think any other division could have fought in. And to that extent, yeah, we probably shaped a little history that way. We could fight in steep terrain, mountain terrain, where there were no roads. It didn't make any difference. We could go almost anywhere easily, quickly, and fight efficiently.
How do you think it personally shaped your life?
Well, it shaped my life because we trained here in Colorado. And Jean and I, my wife, got married in April of 1943, when I graduated from Officers Candidate School. So I was married all the time, most of the time that I was out here. And we both loved it so that we came back, and we've lived here ever since. And if it had not been for that, I probably would have lived in the East where I grew up.
Did you have a sense that you were going to know these people the rest of your life?
To some extent. Some of them, of course, you know, in a 15,000-man division, you certainly don't know everybody. And you know some of them very well. And the ones that came back to this area, yes, we figured, yes, we would know them the rest of our life. But the nice thing is that we've met many, many men since and have known them all the rest of our lives since we met them. And so we have a much broader base of friends than we started with right after the war. It's been a wonderful experience.
One of the things Tom Hames wanted to make sure that I got you to talk about was how your role in the whole Mussolini's villa thing. I understood that you and Gene Hames served together.
No, that isn't quite correct, Abby. At the time of the Mussolini deal, I was in the hospital. I got wounded. Authority has its benefits. The general told Gene Hames, don't touch anything. And so he ordered his men not to touch anything, and he did his very best to enforce that. So then after 2 or 3 days, the general comes over with an empty duck, fills it up with souvenirs from Mussolini's villa, and rides on back. At that point, Gene said to his men, hell, take what you want. And so they each took various things. 1 or 2 of them were nice enough to give me a little souvenir later when I got out of the hospital, but I didn't collect any at the time. And one of the interesting things is that Mussolini had a mistress called Clara Petacchi. And I think everybody remembers the scene of Mussolini and Clara Petacchi hanging by their heels in the square, I think it was in Milan. And one of the more proper Italians took her skirt and tucked it between her legs in a more modest fashion than it was hanging before. But anyway, Clara Petacchi had a collection of dolls that every woman in Italy knew about and every woman in Italy wanted to see. They called them Bambini Petacchi. And one of the guys was smart enough to latch on to 3 or 4 of these Bambini Petacchi. And wherever we went after that, he was swamped with Italian women who wanted to see some of the Bambini Petacchi.
Okay, that's an interesting story. When you were in the worst of conditions, what was it that pulled you through?
In combat?
Mm-hmm.
I think that for me and for most of the guys, it was just a knowledge that we were expected to pull through. We were expected to support the guy on the right, the guy on the left, whatever it was. And we didn't want to let anybody down. So I think it was mostly just that we knew it was expected. We didn't want to let the other guys down, and we just did it. It was nerve-wracking. If you can imagine Germans maybe 100 yards away up on a hill, you can't see them. In the movies, you can always see the enemy, not in war. The Germans, you couldn't tell where they were, but they had machine guns, they had all kinds of other weapons, and here you were walking across an open field, and you had to get up to that hill and kill enough Germans so you could take that hill. Well, to climb out of a safe position and do that took an awful lot of guts. And I think all of the guys who did that, in my opinion, they were heroes.
What was your most memorable battle experience?
Well, that was definitely Mount Belvedere, because Mount Belvedere was the first major attack that the division pulled. And the 3rd Battalion of the 85th was assigned the peak of Mount Belvedere, and I led that attack all the way to the peak. So that, as far as I know, I was the first man to get to the extreme peak of the mountain that night, about 3 a.m., I would say. And then the next day, I engaged a sniper and fire, drove him to cover, and then I went into the German bunkers and captured him and the other Germans that were still hiding there. So that experience was definitely my most important contribution to the war.
What were you thinking when you did it?
Well, I guess I was hoping more than thinking that all those bullets and all those shells wouldn't hit me. And fortunately they didn't. They did hit a lot of the guys, and like your uncle, was it? They hit him. But they didn't hit me then, and I moved straight up. I ran into a machine gun on the way up, and I knocked that out with a grenade. And later I ran into barbed wire, which I crawled under. Later I was almost up at the top, and heavy shelling came in. And that really is terrifying because the shelling was coming directly from a position on Mount Gorgolesco. So it was direct fire onto our positions. And I huddled in a ditch for a little while. And then when the shelling let up, I moved up to the very top of the mountain and got into the German observation trench, which was at the very peak. And it was a lovely position to be in. Germans make very nice trenches, and once I was in that, I felt pretty safe. But they could have come over the top at me, so all night I was kind of worried, and I was keeping an eye on the top, and I had my rifle ready. You know, I'm sure you've heard this story. We were ordered not to load the weapons. But when I got up there, I did load the weapon, and all night long I kept an eye on that little knoll that was between me and them, expecting some to come over, maybe a lot. But none came, and in the next morning, George Dorrington, the battalion S3, said, "Jim, there's a sniper there." And he didn't say any more than that, but I could tell he wanted me to do something about it. So I got in behind, there's a stone on the top of the hill. I got behind that and opened fire on this sniper. And I didn't hit him. On one occasion I knew about where he was going to pop up his head, you know, because he'd pop up and down quickly. Pretty hard to hit that. But I had my rifle, it was a carbine, aimed directly at the spot where I thought his head would come up, and it did. And I squeezed the trigger, and it misfired. Oh, what a sickening sound. And that little fraction of a second gave him a chance to get a pretty good shot at me. And he put a bullet very close to me, and I had a rifleman with a grenade launcher beside me. And I called for him soon after I got there, and he was there, and the bullet kind of went in between the two of us, but we were both lucky that that misfire didn't cause one of us to get hurt.
Did you feel that the Germans were pretty surprised when you got to the top?
Not at that point. They were surprised a little bit earlier in the night. They were surprised that that we were attacking at that time and in the middle of the night, and for all practical purposes we were soundless. And here they are sitting there, no sound, but they know that troops are sneaking up on them little by little. And at that point I think they probably got pretty worried. And as I say, when I got to the top, the observation trench, which should have been manned, was completely empty. So I could jump into it and get that protection. So it was earlier in the evening that I think that the defending troops were surprised. And Field Marshal Kesselring, have you heard of his quote? He made a statement saying that much to my surprise, the remarkable American 10th Mountain Division attacked Mount Belvedere in deep snow and in the night and quickly captured Belvedere. That's a paraphrase. And so it was unexpected by him and unexpected by those troops.
How did you feel climbing up Mount Belvedere with unloaded weapon?
Well, I didn't like it, and I don't think many of the guys did. You felt a little bit naked. You know, the only thing you had was grenades. They would allow us to throw grenades. But you can only throw a grenade so far, and a rifle or a carbine can reach much further. So I think most of us would have preferred to have been the right to fire those weapons. But the general knew that if we did fire them, the flash would give away our position, and we would be in worse shape than if we didn't do it. So I think his decision was right.
The day after Mount Belvedere, what happened to you?
Well, the attack started at 11 o'clock at night, and that was on February 19th. The day after that was February 20th, and that was the day on which we completed the consolidation of the peak, and I captured the remaining Germans in the bunkers. After that, we just took up defensive positions because quite often the Germans would counterattack, and they did not do so. And then later in the afternoon, the 3rd Battalion was moved over behind Mount Gorgolesco, and the 87th Regiment took over the peak.
Did you feel a sense of relief to be out of the lead temporarily?
Well, not all that much, Abby, because once we had cleared the peak, we felt fairly safe. Now, that was kind of a false sense of security because they had dozens of 81 millimeter mortars zeroed in on the peak, and they could have dropped them on us at any time. But we didn't consider that too much. You know, a mortar comes in like a little bird. It doesn't go whoosh like you hear an artillery shell. You don't really hear it until you hear a little whoosh, 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 whoosh. Then you know you better, if you can, find some cover. So they could have dropped mortar shells on us by the hundreds. And our sense of security was a little bit false, but it turned out to be okay.
Do you have any idea why they didn't drop the mortars on you?
No, in fact, I have wondered about that all my life. I think probably since they decided not to counterattack, they decided not to waste the ammunition. If they had counterattacked, they absolutely would have dropped those shells.
How do you think that battle experience pulled your men together?
Well, like any combat experience, I think it pulled them together irretrievably. Once you go through that with friends and comrades, you feel a bond to those guys that you really never felt before. We did feel close to them. We trained a long time together. We did feel close. But once you've gone through a combat situation like that, you feel closer. But actually, I was a little bit shocked. And I think a lot of the guys were. I mean, I had been in this nice German trench, but at about 4:30 or so in the morning, maybe 5, hundreds of shells came in, mortar shells, on the back slope and landed among our men. And they were screaming and moaning and crying, and it was a terrible sound. And actually, that affected me quite a little bit, so much so that the following day, the battalion commander said to one of the other officers, don't you get funny too? In other words, I was acting a little strange because I was so shocked by it. It only took a day or two to get over it, but at that time it was really quite a shocking experience.
How do you think the perspective of the regular infantry soldier differs from an officer's in battle?
Well, the officer feels more responsibility. The first and second lieutenants are called leaders. They are called platoon leaders. And that word is well chosen because they are meant to lead. And the officers who are first or second lieutenants do lead, and the casualties among the first and second lieutenants is the highest of anything in the military because they are out front. That doesn't mean that the men who follow aren't brave, don't risk their necks and don't get shot a lot, but it does mean that they depend on somebody being in front of them. Just like on the night attack on Belvedere, everybody was following me, but there was nobody for me to follow. And it's kind of a similar thing.
Can you talk a little bit about, after Mount Belvedere, what your next battle engagement was?
Yeah, the next battle engagement was probably Mount Delos Bay. there were battles well, no, I take that back. The big battle in between there was della Terraccio. Mount Belvedere was at the left end of a long ridge. Della Terraccio was at the northeast end of that long ridge. And that was a very difficult battle. The 1st Battalion of the 85th had passed through the 2nd Battalion of the 85th had passed through the 1st Battalion of the 85th and continued the attack after Gorgolesco. Belvedere was on the left, Gorgolesco was on the right. They were both very similar mountains, about the same height, and the 1st Battalion had Gorgolesco as its objective. At Gorgolesco, the 2nd Battalion passed through and attacked della Terraccio. But they ran into terrible, terrible trouble. They got in the trees. The Germans dropped shells into those trees, and the shells burst up in the branches and came straight down so that a foxhole didn't do much good. And an awful lot of officers and men were wiped out. Well, finally, the 2nd Battalion, they got as far as they could, and then they had to give up. And then I believe it was one of the battalions of the 86th that took over and captured della Terraccio.
And then what was the next big thing that happened to you then?
Well, after that it was Delos Bay. There were battles in between, but Mount Delos Bay was a very tough one. Our either 1st or 2nd Battalion captured it, and it was a priority for the Germans. And when you got to the top of that hill, I got there a day or so after they had captured it. There was a stench of decaying human flesh. There wasn't a branch or a leaf on any of the trees, and all of the guys had pieces of wood or pieces of tin, whatever they could find, on top of their foxhole to protect against the mortars. So it was a very key location, and the Germans fought very hard, and they did counterattack several times. So that the group that took it, and I can't remember offhand which one was exactly it, they had a bad time.
Did you ever think during these most difficult times that the Americans wouldn't prevail?
No, never occurred to me.
What do you think the core values of the 10th are? What is the spirit of the 10th?
Core values. I think probably the core value is comradeship and loyalty. Probably those two.
What does it mean to you to be 10th?
I'm proud of it, very proud of it, and it means a lot to me.
How has it shaped your life? You said you moved here, but how did it shape your life in other ways, like sort of psychologically?
No, not really. Some of the men, in any group of men, you have some that are very sensitive, and then you have others that are not sensitive at all. And you'll find that anywhere. And I was in the middle, so that the actual experience did not affect me psychologically. Although you might say that it gave me confidence that if I could do that, I could probably do most anything. That would be the only way.
Did it shape you in a positive way in terms of teaching you certain skills that later became valuable to you?
No, except leadership. It did teach leadership skills, handling men, learning that different men have to be handled different ways, and that was very valuable.
Well, as a leader, what was the most difficult thing about leading?
I really, in combat, I can't think of anything that was all that difficult. If I led, they would follow. And I didn't have to argue, I didn't have to give them a pep talk, I didn't have to do anything. I knew that they would follow. Up on the top of Belvedere, when I moved into the German bunkers to capture the remaining. I didn't say a word, but behind me, 6 guys fell in on either side of the trench I was in and followed me down until those Germans came out and surrendered. And I didn't say a word. So I think that leadership in combat is just a matter of leading. Some of the men will follow. Some of the men kind of hang back. And the ones that do the fighting really are probably not more than 50% of the whole group. And those are the ones that will follow. And the others, they just come along later.
How do you think being in that war shaped your attitude towards war in general?
Well, during World War II, I think it was Studs Terkel who wrote a book entitled The Good War. And I think all of us felt that it was the good war. And so I think all of us felt that we were doing the right thing and that we could be proud of our service. How did it shape my attitude since then? I thought the Korean War was extremely important because it showed the Russians we were willing to fight if we had to. The Vietnam War, I didn't like it much better than anybody else. And the Iraq War, I was opposed to it, and I wrote all the congressmen and senators that I could, and I got no answers. But once we were there, the whole situation changed. We are there. We have invested a lot of human life. We have invested a lot of money. We must succeed.
Do you think that's a 10th Mountain attitude in general?
Oh yes, no doubt about it.
When you were back in training, what was the hardest thing you did during training?
I think if you've asked that question to others, you probably got the same answer, and it would be D series. The D series, the division series, was the most difficult. We were out in sub-zero temperatures day after day. We never got inside a building. It was rainy, it was snowing. It was really very, very difficult training, and I'm sure that was the most difficult part of training. Of course, in Camp Swift, it was very difficult the first few days to get out in 110-degree temperature and hike, whereas before that we'd been up at Camp Hale in relatively nice, cool weather, and we didn't have to worry about that. But credit has to be given to the bosses. They caught on pretty quickly, and they made the hikes after that at night. So that was.
What did all the toughness of this training teach you personally?
Did what?
What did all the tough assignments during training teach you personally?
Well, it was the same thing that if we could do that, we could do most anything. I did have one really funny story, though, from D series that I got a big kick out of. And that is that I was leading a patrol. You know, in the D series, you got the red troops who are enemy, the blue troops, they're the good guys. So I was leading a patrol of the good guys, and we came across a machine gun nest. That was the enemy. And so we spread out, and we started to ski down through the snow and through the trees, attacking this machine gun. And right away, one of the guys hit a tree, another one caught a tip and fell down. I hit something and fell down, another guy fell down, and pretty soon just about all the patrol was floundering in the snow. And then this wise guy machine gun sergeant from the enemy said, "Hold your fire, men, they're going to kill themselves." Well, to me, that was one of the most wonderful examples of military humor you could think of. Hold your fire, men, they're going to kill themselves. Spontaneous, you know, really great.
You think most 10th guys had a pretty good sense of humor?
Yes, I think most soldiers, to the extent that they can, have to have. It's the sense of humor can get you through a lot of difficult situations. Yeah, and I do think most of the 10th guys do have a good sense of humor.
What do you think was the difference between the 10th guys and the Flatlanders? Soldiers trained on the Flatlands.
Well, I think I know that the biggest difference was the spirit of unity. You see, we trained together for 3.5 years. No flatland outfit trained for anywhere near that length. My brother-in-law was in the Big Red 1 division. He trained with them for perhaps 120 days, and then he went over to combat. Well, he hardly knew the guys in the Big Red 1. But we had trained together for years, and so the biggest difference was that we had a great feeling of unity that they did not ever have the chance to develop.
Did you feel like, what do you think caused this sense of unity, besides being together that long? Anything?
Well, it's sharing common hardships. When you share common hardships with a bunch of people, it pulls you together. And I don't care whether it's military or private life. Years ago, my wife and I went to Burma, and it was an organized tour, and just about everything went wrong.